Thank God, this incredible HFY masterpiece found you today. Witness the legend starting now. The Nexus Military Academy on Station Arcturus had a reputation for producing the galaxy's finest warriors, strategists, and leaders. What it also had, though nobody mentioned this in the recruitment brochures, was a charming tendency to crush dreams with the efficiency of a neutron star collapsing. The Academy's motto, carved in 17 different alien scripts above the main entrance, read, "Strength through trial." The unofficial motto, whispered in dormitory corridors, was more along the lines of survival through luck. The station itself was a marvel of engineering, a crystalline structure that rotated slowly in the void, its faceted surface catching starlight like a cosmic disco ball. Inside, the Academy's halls buzzed with the controlled chaos of 1,000 different species learning to work together, which was about as smooth as teaching a karate to knit. The corridors were filled with the sounds of clashing training weapons, the hiss of environmental suits, and the occasional frustrated roar from someone who just discovered that their tentacles were in fact not suitable for operating standard-issue pulse rifles. At the bottom of this glorious hierarchy of interspecies music, military cooperation, sat Nix Reeves, human, aged 19 standard years, music, and currently holding the distinguished position of most likely to be eaten by her own shadow. She wasn't particularly tall, particularly strong, or particularly anything that would make a drill instructor's heart sing with joy. What she was, however, was stubborn in the way that only humans could be stubborn, which was to say, completely and utterly unreasonable about accepting defeat. The Academy's ranking system was beautifully simple in its cruelty. Physical prowess determined everything. If you could bench press a small shuttle, you got respect. If you could run a kilometer under 3 minutes while carrying full battle gear, you got admiration. If you were Nix Reeves, you got to clean the waste recyclers while everyone else was having dinner. The logic was sound, according to the Academy's administrators. And GT music, and GT in space. When things went wrong, physical capability often meant the difference between life and death. The fact that this logic conveniently ignored about a dozen other crucial factors was apparently beside the point. The Academy's cadets came from across the galaxy, each species bringing their own particular brand of superiority complex. The karate, with their chitinous armor and muscles that could crush steel, dominated the combat rankings. The Zephyrians, tall and graceful with their 4 arms and natural tactical genius, ruled the strategy courses. And then there were the humans, who were mostly good at looking confused and asking awkward questions about why everything was so needlessly complicated. Nix's daily routine had become a sort of performance art in humiliation. Morning physical training meant watching her alien classmates effortlessly complete exercises that left her gasping for breath. Equipment designed for species with natural strength, and GT music, and GT 3 times that of humans, meant she spent half her time figuring out how to even hold the damn things properly. The Academy's standard-issue training gear was, to put it mildly, not built with human ergonomics in mind. A karate cadet could swing a practice sword one-handed while doing jumping jacks. Nix needed both hands and a prayer to the deity of her choice just to lift the thing. The academy's social structure was as rigid as its academic one. At the top sat the physical elite, the cadets, who could bench press small aircraft and run through walls. Below them were they specialists music, those who excelled in particular areas but lacked the raw physical dominance of the top tier, and at the very bottom, in a category all by herself, was Nyx. She wasn't just the weakest human cadet, she was the weakest cadet, period. The academy's other human students, while not exactly setting records, at least managed to avoid being a complete embarrassment to their species. The worst part wasn't the daily humiliation or the knowing looks from instructors who were clearly wondering how she'd managed to pass the entrance exams. The worst part was that she was actually good at the academic side of things: strategy, logistics, xenobiology, stellar navigation. Give her a problem that required thinking rather than lifting, and she could solve it faster than most of her classmates. Unfortunately, the academy's music philosophy seemed to be that smart cadets were useful right up until the moment they needed to physically implement their brilliant plans. And GT, music, and GT, at which point they became expensive paperweights. The ringleader of her daily torment was Thexmal, a karate whose idea of subtle psychological warfare involved asking her to open containers that he deliberately sealed too tightly for human hands. Thexmal had the kind of confidence that came from never having met a problem he couldn't solve by hitting it harder, which worked surprisingly well in most military situations. His gang of followers included a Thak named Krell, who found human weakness personally offensive, and a Zephyrian called Quinn Nixa, who seemed to view Nyx's struggles as some sort of fascinating scientific experiment. The upcoming final trial loomed over the academy like a particularly ominous storm cloud. This was the make or break assessment that would determine who graduated to actual military service and who got shipped home with a polite letter thanking them for their interest in galactic defense. The trial was designed to test everything: combat skills, tactical thinking, leadership under pressure, and GT, music, and GT, and the ability to work as part of a team. It was also, according to academy tradition, designed to weed out anyone who couldn't handle the realities of military life. The failure rate was impressively high, which the academy wore as a badge of honor. For Nyx, the final trial represented the end of a dream that had probably been unrealistic from the start. She'd applied to the academy because she believed in the ideals it represented: unity among species, music, protection of the innocent, and the advancement of galactic civilization. What she'd found instead, music, was a system that valued brute force over intelligence, conformity over innovation, and the ability to lift heavy objects over the ability to think through complex problems. Still, music. She wasn't ready to give up. Humans as a species had a disturbing tendency to keep trying even when the situation was clearly hopeless. The academy's exotic training grounds were a testament to both advanced technology and questionable decision-making. The facility included everything from zero-gravity combat simulators to environmental chambers that could replicate the conditions on any of 1,000 different worlds. The crown jewel of the training complex was The biological preserve, a massive, enclosed habitat that housed specimens from across the galaxy. The preserve served a dual purpose. It provided realistic training scenarios involving dangerous wildlife, and it gave the Academy's xenobiology department something to study when they weren't busy explaining why certain species shouldn't be kept in the same enclosure. The preserve's most famous residents were the Gorthak, apex predators from the mining worlds of the Outer Rim. These creatures were the stuff of nightmares, 7 m long, covered in natural armor plating, with jaws that could snap a shuttlecraft in half. They weighed approximately 700 kg each, could run at speeds that made cheetahs look lazy, and had the charming habit of treating anything that moved as either prey or a threat to be eliminated. The Academy kept 3 of them in a specially designed containment area, and senior cadets were occasionally allowed to observe them from behind several layers of reinforced shielding. The creatures were used for advanced training exercises, which was a polite way of saying that they were let loose in controlled environments to chase cadets around and see who survived. Morning of the incident started like any other, which in retrospect should have been the first warning sign. The preserve training exercise was supposed to be routine, a simple navigation and resource gathering mission in the outer sections of the habitat. The cadets would be divided into teams, given basic equipment, and tasked with locating and retrieving a series of markers while avoiding the less dangerous wildlife. It was the kind of exercise designed to build teamwork and confidence, which meant that something was almost certainly going to go wrong. Nyx found herself assigned to Team 7 along with Thexmal, Krell, and 3 other cadets she barely knew. The team dynamic was about what you'd expect. Thexmal immediately assumed leadership. Krell appointed himself as muscle, and everyone else fell in line. Nyx was assigned the role of equipment carrier, which was a diplomatic way of saying the person who gets to haul everyone else's gear while they do the important stuff. The team's equipment included standard navigation tools, emergency beacons, and enough rations to last a day. What it notably didn't include was any form of defensive weaponry, because this was supposed to be a safe, controlled environment. The first sign of trouble came when their communication devices started malfunctioning. The preserve's dense vegetation, music, and mineral deposits in the soil were known to interfere with electronics, but the disruption was worse than usual. The second sign was when their navigation equipment began giving contradictory readings. The third sign, which even the Xmore couldn't ignore, was when they heard roaring in the distance. The Academy's safety protocols were extensive and in theory foolproof. The preserve's containment systems were designed with multiple redundancies, automated monitoring, and emergency response procedures that could handle any conceivable situation. What they hadn't planned for was a cascade failure triggered by a solar flare that interfered with the station's power grid. The containment fields flickered. The monitoring systems went offline, and somewhere in the preserve's restricted sections, very large and very hungry predators began to notice that their boundaries had suddenly become more like suggestions. Team 7's situation went from mildly concerning to genuinely terrifying in about 30 seconds. The roaring was getting closer, and it was becoming increasingly clear that whatever was making those sounds was both large and upset. The Xmor's confident leadership suddenly looked a lot less impressive when faced with the possibility of being eaten by something that wasn't supposed to be their training area. Krell's natural aggression turned into barely controlled panic music when he realized that his thick hide might not be quite as protective as he'd hoped. The other cadets began looking around desperately for somewhere to hide, run, or preferably both. The first Gothak appeared through the undergrowth like a living nightmare, 7M of armored death moving with the fluid grace of music, a predator that had never met anything it couldn't kill. Its eyes, each the size of a dinner plate, fixed on the group of cadets with the sort of interest that prey animals typically found deeply unsettling. The creature's jaws opened slightly, revealing rows of teeth that could have been used as industrial cutting tools, and it made a sound that was part growl, part roar, and entirely focused on the business of turning the cadets into bite-sized pieces. The team's response was immediate and predictable. The Xmor, the confident leader, froze like a statue. Krell, the muscle, discovered that his aggressive nature had limits, and those limits were apparently 7M long with very big teeth. The other cadets scattered in different directions, which was probably the worst possible tactical response, but definitely the most instinctive one. This left Nick standing in the middle of the clearing, holding everyone's equipment face to face with something that viewed her as an hors d'oeuvre. What happened next would become the stuff of Academy legend, retold, hushed whispers and increasingly exaggerated versions until it took on the quality of myth. The Gothak, having sized up its options, decided that the small human would make a suitable appetizer before moving on to the main courses. It gathered itself for a charge, muscles bunching under its armored hide, and launched itself forward with the kind of acceleration that made physics professors weep with joy. Nix's response was not what anyone, including herself, expected. Instead of running, freezing, or doing any of the other things that small prey animals typically did when faced with large predators, she dropped the equipment, planted her feet, and caught the charging Gothak with her bare hands. For a moment the tableau was almost artistic, a 700 kg apex predator, suspended in midair, held at arm's length by a human cadet who barely came up to its chin. Then physics reasserted itself, and Nix did something that defied every law of common sense, several laws of physics, and the Academy's firmly held beliefs about human capabilities. She threw it. Not a gentle toss, not a desperate shove, but a full-bodied throw that launched the Gothak in a graceful arc. Across the clearing, the creature landed with a sound like a small earthquake, rolled several times, then came to rest against a tree that immediately decided it would rather be somewhere else. The Gothak, for its part, lay stunned for several seconds before shaking its head and looking around with the confused expression of a predator that had just discovered that the food chain was more flexible than previously. Music. Thud. The silence that followed was profound. Even the preserve's background noises seemed to pause, as if the local ecosystem was collectively trying to process what it had just witnessed. The Xmor's jaw had dropped so far that it was in danger of becoming a tripping hazard. Krell was making a sound that might have been words in his native language, but could just as easily have been the noise of his worldview collapsing. The other cadets were staring at Nix with the kind of expression typically reserved for religious experiences or particularly impressive explosions. The Gothic, meanwhile, had decided that discretion was the better part of not being thrown again. It gathered itself up, gave Nix a look that was equal parts respect and concern, and slunk back into the undergrowth. The other two Gothic, who had been approaching from different directions, apparently decided that they had pressing business elsewhere and faded back into the preserve's depths. The immediate danger was over, but the real crisis was just beginning. The Academy's response to the incident was swift, thorough, and characterized by the kind of bureaucratic panic that occurs when established procedures suddenly prove inadequate. Emergency teams swept the preserve, communication systems were restored, and the containment failures were traced and repaired. The official report would later describe the event as a minor technical malfunction with no lasting consequences, which was the kind of creative writing that made military public relations officers drink. The unofficial response was considerably more interesting. Within hours, every cadet in the Academy had heard some version of the story. The details varied wildly. Some versions had Nix wrestling the Gothic music into submission, others had her picking up and throwing all three creatures simultaneously, but the core facts remained consistent enough to be believable. A human cadet, the weakest member of her class, had single-handedly defeated a creature that senior cadets were taught to fear and respect. Revelation that followed was simple concept but revolutionary in its implications. Earth's gravity music was approximately 3 times the galactic standard. Every other species in the Academy had evolved on worlds where moving was easier, lifting was simpler, and physical effort was correspondingly less demanding. Humans, by contrast, had spent their entire evolutionary history fighting music against a gravitational pull that would have crushed most other species. Music, every step they took, every movement they made, every breath they drew was accomplished against resistance music that their alien classmates literally couldn't comprehend. Nix hadn't been weak. She'd been training under conditions that would have been considered torture for most other species. Every exercise that left her gasping for breath had been like working out while wearing a suit of armor. Every piece of equipment that she'd struggled to lift had been absurdly heavy by her standards, not because she was inadequate, but because it was designed for species that had never had to develop the kind of raw physical power that humans took for granted. The Academy's carefully constructed hierarchy crumbled overnight. The physical superiority music that species like the karate had taken for granted suddenly looked less impressive when viewed in the context of gravitational assistance. The training equipment that had been designed for universal use was hastily recalibrated. Music, the ranking system that had placed humans at the bottom, was quietly revised to account for environmental factors that had somehow been overlooked in the Academy's 500-year history. For Nix, the transformation was as sudden as it was complete. The shy cadet, who had been cleaning waste recyclers, found herself the center of attention from instructors who wanted to study human physiology, cadets who wanted to know if all humans were secretly capable of throwing large predators and military recruiters who were suddenly very interested in the potential applications of gravity-adapted soldier. The Academy's social dynamics underwent a rapid and permanent shift, with humans moving from the bottom of the hierarchy to something approaching the top. The final trial, when it came, was almost anticlimactic. The same assessment that had seemed impossible for a weak human cadet proved manageable for someone who had spent her entire life training under conditions that would have been considered extreme by galactic standards. The combat simulations that had been designed to challenge the strongest music cadets became exercises in restraint for someone who had to consciously hold back to avoid accidentally breaking the equipment. The teamwork exercises that had been built around the assumption that humans would need protection and assistance became studies in how to coordinate with someone who could single-handedly accomplish most of the mission objectives. The Academy's graduation ceremony that year was memorable for several reasons, not least of which was the sight of Nix Reeves receiving the Medal of Excellence from a commandant who still looked slightly stunned by the entire situation. The medal was traditionally given to the cadet who best exemplified the Academy's ideals of strength, leadership, and dedication. It had never before been awarded to someone who had spent most of their training period being used as a cautionary example of what happened when recruitment standards weren't carefully maintained. The years that followed saw significant changes to the Academy's policies and procedures. Human physiology became a required course for all cadets, not just those specializing in xenobiology. The equipment standards were revised to account for gravitational differences between species. Music. The ranking system was overhauled to consider relative rather than absolute performance measures. Most importantly, the Academy's motto was quietly amended to read strength through trial, wisdom through understanding. The preserve, meanwhile, was modified to include new safety features and updated containment systems. The Gothak were relocated to a more secure facility, though not before the Academy's xenobiology department had completed extensive studies on their behavior when faced with gravity-adapted humans. The results of these studies were classified, but rumors suggested that the creatures had developed what could best be described as a healthy respect for bipedal primates. Nix herself went on to a distinguished career in galactic military service, specializing in operations that required both tactical thinking and the ability to accomplish seemingly impossible physical feats. She became something of a legend among human military personnel, and her story was used as a recruiting tool for the Academy's human outreach programs. The Academy's enrollment of human cadets increased dramatically in the years following the incident, though few of them would ever face the same challenges that had defined Nix's early training. The most lasting change, however, was in the way the galaxy's military establishment viewed human potential. The species that had been considered physically inferior and suitable mainly for support roles suddenly found themselves in demand for frontline combat positions. The Academy's other species learned to view their human classmates with a mixture of respect, caution, and the kind of healthy fear that comes from knowing that your study partner could, if necessary, throw you across the room. The irony of the situation was not lost. Music on the Academy's administrators, who had spent centuries building a system based on the assumption that physical capability was the most important factor in military success. They had created an institution that valued strength above all else, only to discover that they had been consistently underestimating the strength of an entire species. The Academy's reputation for producing the galaxy's finest warriors remained intact, but the definition of finest had been permanently expanded to include music qualities that weren't immediately apparent on standardized fitness tests. In the end, the story of Nyx Reeves and the Gothak became more than just an Academy legend. It became a reminder that assumptions about capability, strength, and potential could be dangerously wrong, and that sometimes the most important qualities were the ones that couldn't be measured in a gymnasium or demonstrated in a training exercise. The galaxy's military academies began to place greater emphasis on adaptability, resilience, and the ability to exceed expectations under pressure, qualities that humans, as it turned out, had been developing for millennia. The shy cadet who had once been the Academy's greatest disappointment became its most celebrated graduate, proving that strength came in many forms and that sometimes the most impressive victories were won not through overwhelming force but through the quiet determination to keep trying when everyone else had given up. Academy's halls still echoed with the sounds of training and preparation, but now they also carried the whispered stories of the day when everything changed and the galaxy learned that assumptions about human weakness had been, to put it mildly, somewhat premature, and somewhere in the preserve, carefully contained and respectfully maintained, the Gothak continued their existence as apex predators, though they had perhaps gained a new appreciation for the complex and often surprising nature of interspecies relations. The Academy's motto, carved in 17 different scripts above the main entrance, remained a testament to the institution's values, but now it carried a deeper meaning that encompassed not just the strength to endure trials, but the wisdom to understand that strength itself came in forms that defied easy categorization or simple measurement.